let's get to unpacking the state climate plan. We have with us tonight two members of the Climate Council, and both have promised to provide us with good insider knowledge of where things are and where things are headed. They are Peter Iwanowitz, who you know as the Executive Director of Environmental Advocates New York. Many of you know him well enough. And Bob Howarth, who is the professor of Ecology and Environmental Biology at Cornell University. And we'll put a link to his full bio in the chat. So both Bob and Peter were appointed to the council by Speaker of the Assembly, Carl Hastie. And we also have with us tonight Amy Salzman, who I'm delighted to introduce. Amy's been a member of the EA New York Board of Directors since 2015, and she's going to be moderating the discussion for us this evening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy. There you are. And enjoy. If you have any questions, just put them in the chat, and the real Nick Moore, the official Nick Moore, will make sure that we keep track of everyone's questions. Okay, thanks. Over to you, Amy. Thank you.
I can't resist, actually. I know Peter and Bob are dying to tell you the inside scoop on the action plan, but I just had to catch a moment. We're in this, I mean, we've been in this extraordinary crisis about climate change for a long time. But right now, I mean, yesterday, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the beginning of its 6th assessment. And it found that human-caused climate change is capitalized, is dangerous and widespread now. And then the Supreme Court yesterday heard argument over whether the EPA has the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. And frankly, it's pretty likely that they will narrow EPA's authority to do it. We've got Russia invading Ukraine, which is affecting gas and oil supplies and prices. We've got President Biden giving his first State of the Union tonight, where he is unfortunately not going to be celebrating passage enactment of the Build Back Better plan. What New York is doing could not be more important. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is one of the boldest actions in the world. And I am just so pleased that Bob and Peter were participating in the group of experts to figure out how to make it happen. And so I want to thank them. I want to thank you for being here. It's one of these urgencies that you keep thinking it can't get more urgent, but it seems to be that way. Anyhow, so I want to reiterate what Jessica said. This is a conversation. This is not a panel discussion. So we're going to skip around and talk a lot about the plan and how it's going to get implemented. But please raise your hand, put a note in the chat. Others will be looking to make sure that we don't forget you, and everyone can, in fact, be Nick Moore. We can all wear Nick Moore tags. Okay, so with that, I think what we'd like to start with is I'd like to ask Peter and Bob both, and maybe starting with Bob because he's our guest, kind of reflecting on the past. What is it? Has it been 1 year or 2 years that you've been working on this plan? 2 years.
It's 2 years this month, yeah.
Sort of the plan and COVID, is there a relationship between the two? The timing seems strange. In any case, Bob, we'd love to hear your reflections on what it's been like.
Sure. No, I'd love to just give you a quick introduction to that. Let me just say that you've phrased it exactly right. The IPCC report has just come out. Scientific consensus is that we really only have 8 years to get things right. We're running out of time. The CLCPA has the correct time frame there in terms of goals and all. And I want to mention the leadership of Barbara Lifton, since she's on this call tonight. Barbara is one of the people who made the CLCPA possible. And it really is, I think, the most progressive climate legislation, not only of any state, but perhaps any government in the world. So just quickly to remind those of you who aren't paying attention to it on a daily basis, the CLCPA sets New York up for a unique way to look at greenhouse gas accounting. We more heavily weight the role of methane than traditionally has been done. And that's important because the IPCC is telling us that about 40 to 45% of all of the warming to date over the last centuries come from methane, which tends to be greatly underestimated by other states and governments. CLCPA says that we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions statewide from all economic sectors by 40% by 8 years from now. 70% of all electricity by 8 years from now has to be renewable. 100% of our electricity by 2040 has to be carbon free. And then by 2050, we're supposed to be carbon neutral and have cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 85%. The CLCPA also says that at least 40% of all benefits should go to the historically disadvantaged in the state. So, Peter and I are two of the 22 people on the council. It's a true honor to serve on it. The charge of the council is to come up with an implementation plan to make all of these goals work. And once we have an implementation plan, then state agencies are supposed to enact them. We started work just 2 years ago. Just as COVID was breaking out, we had one live meeting, and then virtually everything since then has been remote via Zoom. We're charged with coming up with a draft implementation plan at the end of last year, which we did. And we have to have a final plan by the end of this year, which we will. The draft implementation plan that we came up with is, I think, a strong plan. We endorsed it unanimously, although there is some last minute debate back on December 20th in our 5-hour meeting, and we can go into detail about that. Both Peter and I brought up a series of issues, and I'm happy to say that we were able to carry the day on those. The plan that we have is completely consistent with the goals of the CLCPA. If we stick with the plan, we'll meet those goals. However, we did put some issues aside, which still need to be discussed, debated, and decided this year. We're going to public input. There's 6 or 7 hearings coming up in the next few months. One of the prominent things we put aside is funding mechanisms, how we're going to pay for things. And also there's some contradictions in the report, which we can talk about, particularly on so-called renewable natural gas, biofuels, and also how large of a role for hydrogen. Just a little bit on process. We had a series, I think there were 9 in the end, advisory panels to the council. And these, the panels did an excellent job. They met an incredible amount of time over the last 2 years themselves. And they were set up sector by sector. So there's an ag and forestry one, there's a housing energy efficiency one, there's a transportation one, et cetera. And they had very talented members who I think well represented the diversity of interest and expertise in the state. And for the most part, they're led by agency heads in that associated area. And I was a little skeptical of how well that would work, but in fact, it's worked extremely well. And over time, the panels, we debated the panel input. We've accepted most of what they recommended with some changes. But they did a good job, and the agencies and the bureaucracies of the agencies, the leadership, have bought into what has come out of these panels, which I think was a brilliant move. I'll give you one example, which I follow particularly closely. Under the new accounting rules for methane in our state, the #1 economic sector for greenhouse gas emissions is heating of homes and commercial buildings. And people just didn't pay attention to that early on. And the Housing and Energy Efficiency Panel didn't really understand that early on, say 2 years ago. But over time they did, and their recommendations, which are part of our implementation plan, are really quite progressive. So we are calling about no longer allowing any fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, propane in new home construction 2 years from now, and 5 years from now, not in commercial new construction or multifamily homes, and then starting to retrofit the existing building stock. There's 6 million individual family homes in New York that are heated with gas and other fossil fuels, and we have a plan to move those off of gas pretty aggressively. If we follow through, our use of natural gas in the state will be cut by 1/3 to 35% or so within the next 10 to 12 years. So really quite aggressive. And finally, I just want to say that I think we got off to a slow start. COVID didn't help, but the panels came along strongly, and in the end, I think the the council has come on strongly. Our leadership was good. And there was a tremendous amount of sort of pent up energy for actually making the CLCPA work that most all of us on the Climate Action Council have felt by the end. And that was released quite suddenly when Governor Cuomo resigned and we got a new governor. And I think Kathy Hochul has demonstrated that she endorses the vision of the CLCPA and is endorsing what we've suggested in our implementation plan. So I think it's a very, very exciting time in a world where many things are very discouraging. Here in New York, I think our momentum's in the right direction. So I'll turn over to Peter for that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bob. It's great to be with you. And I think a little bit of modesty on your part, but and there are a number of EA staffers on the line. I think several of us have always looked at that provision that was tucked into one of the early drafts of what was then known as the CCPA, which we affectionately called the Howarth provision, where we did an honest accounting of methane emissions into the 20-year global warming potential. I see Connor raising his thumb up there. Let me just do a quick round. It looks like we have Connor Bainbrook, our Director of Climate Policy, with us tonight. He'll be answering questions in the chat if they pop up. Kate Carrera, our Deputy Director. Amanda Sachs, I think, is on the line as well. These are all, Amanda is our Climate Program Associate and Legislative Associate. And they'll be available to you all to answer questions in the chat as they pop up, but also just, it's part of the amazing climate team at EA that is working to implement this law after fighting for many years to get it into fruition as well. I may be a little bit of a tougher grader than Bob when it comes to the panels and some of the agency representations. And I think they've done a wonderful job, but I think in a couple of different respects, and I think we'll get into it and unpack it a little bit tonight. There's a couple areas where I thought that the leadership of the panels started off in a spot that wasn't as progressive or inspirational as it could have been, and that led to some discussions were a little bit limited. But I agree with Bob. Overall, this is a really strong draft, and I think that pent up energy from the agency staff that. Some of the staff that worked on the first go around of a climate action plan for New York back in 2009 and 10 that was pursuant to a Governor Patterson executive order. And I'm happy to see that there's some people here tonight that were actually part of that process with me. I think that pent up energy was really released, particularly this fall. We ended up with a really decent draft plan that's out for comment. Bob had pointed out to some areas that definitely need to be improved, and I think we'll improve that. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and getting into it. Amy, just a couple of small reflections personally on it. I mean, I think the pandemic certainly limited the ability for the council to sort of hear and feel from the public as we went through our meetings. It was kind of sterilized as the public was there. Paying attention to the meetings over sort of the web interface. So we missed the opportunity to have the public with us in the room. But I clearly think that having the panels have their discussions online allowed for greater participation from our broader cross segment of the public, because people didn't have to trip into Albany or to New York City or to the typical places where government would hold these types of meetings. So I think that was also a benefit of having more interaction and online. I will say, it could have been more interesting should the council have been able to meet more in person and had sidebar conversations before or after or during the meeting and maybe over cocktails. But we'll see as we go forward in the next year to finalize this plan. Maybe we'll have a little bit more of that esprit de corps and get a lot more engagement with the public. I'm personally looking forward to the in-person public hearings that should be coming up later this spring. We'll be able to feel and understand where the public is on this issue and hear those real personal stories about why New York State needs to have a final plan that lives up to the emissions reduction goals, the urgency of the moment, but more importantly, New York State really has an opportunity to lead on equity and justice for disadvantaged communities and those who are on the front lines of this crisis, because that's what this law really is about. It's about climate, but it's about equity and justice as we make this transition off of fossil fuels. So I'll turn it back to you, Amy. You can start.
All right, I'll be willing.
Questioning us. probing more deeply.
Other folks join the grill. So one question that I wanted to ask is, are there some examples of like unexpected victories? And also, what were the low points of getting, I mean, and do it, the substance, not just the, we couldn't meet in person part, but I mean, what were some real wins and what were some losses that we really need to keep our eyes on during the next year when it goes out for public review?
I think the most exciting positive development are the panel recommendations out of the Housing and Energy Efficiency Panel, which I've already briefly mentioned. But you know, I sat in on most of their panels. Just going back a little bit to what Peter said a minute ago, the council itself, I think we had 19 or 20 meetings altogether. I lost track. 2 of them were in person, mostly remote. But these 9 or so panels also all had at least 12 and in some cases 20 meetings. So there were hundreds of meetings going on. And the fact that they were remote, at least for me, living in the Finger Lakes area, made it possible to participate. So I went to all of the panel meetings for the Housing and Energy Efficiency Panel and a few others, which I couldn't have done otherwise. And that particular panel, you know, they started off quite slowly, to be frank. They didn't appreciate how important the heating needs are to greenhouse gas emissions, particularly when we start accounting for methane emissions. And so they were thinking in fairly traditional terms of, you know, if we increase winter weatherization programs by 30%, wouldn't it be wonderful? And I gently nudged them and said, you know, that's not going to make it. We need to do something that's much more radical. We need to degasify heating in this state. And you know, at first I got sort of blank stares, but you know, over the course of the first 6 months or so, they've started to realize that that was true. We need to degasify, and the recommendations they've come up with do precisely that. You know, if we follow through with what they recommend and what's in our draft implementation plan, no one will be using fossil fuels for heating by 2045 or so, and we'll cut it in half by what, 2035 or so. That is really very, very radical. Nowhere else in the world has that occurred, and it is what we need to do to make it. And it's important for New York. You know, I actually think we're on a reasonable trajectory anyway to move towards renewable electricity. More needs to be done, but the state had some momentum, and the council plan's moving the right way. I'm a little disappointed with transportation, to be honest, but in fact, we're handicapped by federal law. We can only do what the EPA allows or what the state of California is doing, and that we can do a little bit more than that. And there's a little bit more than that in our plan, but it's a handicap. But you know, the state of New York has often looked to California for leadership generally on issues, and we can't for heating. You know, they just don't have the challenges we do. And so this really is a place where New York has to rise to the challenge nationally. And I think we have, and I'm very pleasantly surprised to have seen that happen.
Thank you. Peter, anything on your mind?
Yeah, I'll just add to Bob, and you know, the buildings piece, and you know, was led by 2 strong women. You know, Commissioner Vasilakis from Housing and Community Renewal, and Janet Joseph, who's retiring soon from NYSERDA. They've been at this industry in a long time, and they really understood the opportunity and ran with it, particularly in the last 6 months. With the changeover of the governor, they really leaned in on that. And you're seeing that with Governor Hochul taking some key provisions from the draft plan and trying to legislate that right now in the state budget process. You know, the dramatic shift we're going to have to do on moving away new construction from natural gas is something that is on the table right now in budget discussions in Albany, and that flows right out of these meetings and right out of the plan. You know, I agree with Bob. I mean, I think, you know, we are limited to what we can do on transportation. We have to try to figure out how to supercharge that. I mean, the plan's honest though. I mean, we need to get to, and I'm just going to throw out some numbers. And sorry, apologies for those who are looking for a slide presentation. If you came for the slides, you're in the wrong meeting. We're just discussing tonight, no slide deck. But right now we have about 0.5%. So 0.5% of the passenger vehicles on our road are electric vehicles. And we need to get to about 1/3 of the passenger vehicles on our roads to be electric in 7.5 years. And that's just an honest, frank assessment of how we have to shift that. And we were dependent upon other states to sort of put emission standards, but we're going to have to throw a lot of money at incentivizing the purchase for new and used EVs. We're going to have to do a heck of a lot of work in getting better at public charging infrastructure and doing it the right way and understanding where people will do that. And, I'm happy that the plan has that honest, frank assessment of it, but quite honestly, one of the biggest shortcomings of the plan is we didn't get around to talking about how we pay for all this and putting an honest pay for on the table. Because there's a lot of stuff. Strategic decommissioning of the natural gas infrastructure that's out there, that's in our plan. A recognition that natural gas utilities quite possibly could cease to be in business by 2050, and what that will mean to actually funding retraining of workers and new job opportunities. Huge opportunities, but we don't have the money right now on the table, and there's no serious discussion right now in this budget fight of actually how we pay for it. And I think a lot of people were hoping that the draft plan would have a pay for it, and we just ran out of time. And I'll just sort of wrap up by saying another key shortcoming is the draft plan did not fully appreciate the input that we received from the Climate Justice Working Group. And I know he was here earlier. I don't see his name popping up on my screen, but Eddie Batista, who's head of New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, a board member of EA, and a member of that Climate Justice Working Group, he and his colleagues in that panel provided a lot of meaningful input. And if you've read the plan, there's a number of places where we recognize it, we pat it on the head, but didn't fully adjudicate the opposition to key issues that the Climate Justice Working Group would do. I will say I'm happy that there was a fair assessment and a real deep understanding in the public health sector of the plan of the negative impacts of biofuels. And we don't treat those as carbon neutral. And we have an honest discussion of the public health impacts of burning things like ethanol in combustion engines. And that's the first time I think I've seen a New York State document that is that frank about the negative externalities of biofuels, both the public health ones and the environmental ones. But there's still too many places in the plan where there's a contemplation of using biofuels as a way to decarbonize, and that has to be harmonized before it gets out. But overall, it's pretty amazing.
Just one more word on the funding and the cost. We do have analyses on what the overall cost of the plan will be, and we have a detailed jobs analysis too. And clearly, it's good for jobs. There's no doubt about that. The biggest losers of jobs are those individuals who work in gasoline stations and also sell lotto tickets and things on the side. That's literally half the job loss will be there. Overall, it's a big increase in jobs and higher quality jobs. And the dollar cost is large, and yet the net savings to the state are greater than the cost, because we'll have less air pollution, less illness from that, less time away from work and school, less premature death. And when you add that in, plus the climate benefits, the economic benefit analysis clearly shows that the plan works. But that's not the same as transferring those funds and determining how we're going to pay for it in detail. And we simply did not get meaningfully into that discussion last year. That's going to be a big challenge for us this year. And I'm looking forward to hearing creative ideas from the community, from the public on it.
So, out of the corner of my eye, I'm seeing Michael Northrop with a question in the chat. Will analysis be done on the economic impacts of the plan's implementation? Yes, there is one, a benefit cost analysis in the plan. And, it's being criticized as not being robust enough by those opponents and some members of the council. But there is an economic analysis, and the benefits vastly outweigh the cost to the tune of a minimum of $90 billion. Benefits outweighing the cost, up to $120 billion benefits over costs by 2050. And I'll just add one last point, that there is an analysis in the plan that says the failure to act, meaning if we ignore the problem and say it's something we can't wrap our heads around and do, if the failure to act actually costs New York State $90 billion more than the cost of acting. So if we do all these steps, we create these jobs, we save lives, we reduce illness and premature mortality, all those things add up to be a huge economic winner for the state. And if we don't, well, it costs us $90 billion more. So it's economically foolish not to do this, as well as the public health and the environmental imperative. I know
in
there are
addition-
some other hands up, but so.
Yeah, let me just add to that, because in addition to the cost benefit analysis, there's a whole issue of predictability of energy costs. And that the plan will result in an energy future where you know what your energy costs will be far into the future. We won't have these natural gas spikes that we're seeing now. So it'll be far, far better for people. And for the average, there's also detailed analysis, say, of the new construction, because some critics argued, well, gee, if you make people use beneficial electrification in new construction instead of natural gas, isn't that going to cost them money? And the answer is no, it actually saves them money. They should be doing it anyway. It's just that we haven't moved that way. And of course, there's some subsidies that go into the natural gas system too, some hidden and some not so much so. Currently, if you build a new home and you live near a gas main, under existing state law, the gas company has to connect you at their cost, eventually made up by consumers, of course, to the gas main. That's a significant hidden subsidy to putting gas into new homes. We get rid of that and the economics will be far, far more preferable for instead using heat pumps.
Jackie, you had your hand raised. Do you still have a question?
I do. Thank you for that. Hi, Peter. Hi, Bob. Thank you so much for hosting this webinar. I just wanted to get your reactions to the forestry section and the recommendations that were included in there. I'm curious if you thought that they adequately pondered carbon storage in addition to carbon sequestration. There seems to be a particular emphasis on that. And I'm curious also about your reactions to the Keeping Forests as Forest law. With COVID, we've seen a great migration to our rural areas, which means that those rural areas where forests are, that land's being developed. And knowing that our forests are limited resources, how can we realistically expect to protect our forests if we're seeing more development? And just general reactions to that, to the forestry section in general too.
Yeah, that's a great question. And looking at the ag and forestry side of it, currently it's a pretty minor part of the overall emissions, but the agricultural emissions, that they're not expected to increase. But as we move towards 2050 and everything else goes down, as our plan is laid out now, the agricultural emissions will proportionally increase. And by 2050, if we don't act more aggressively than our plan says, then they're going to be a third, 40% of emissions by 2050. So that's the ag side of thing. On forestry, we want to keep forests intact to sequester as much carbon as we can. New York has a lot of forest land. It's still not going to be huge relative to our use of fossil fuels now, but we should do whatever we can. I think there are some pretty progressive aspects in the implementation plan to do that. One is that, under existing policy in the state, forest management is oriented towards production. That's the goal. Quality, but maximizing quality production of lumber and wood products. We're not saying we shouldn't still have lumber production and products, but there's equal weight given to other things that forests do for us, improving water quality, improving carbon sequestration, homes of biodiversity. And so giving equal weight to the management policies to those other environmental goods and not making it all about the price of lumber, I think is quite progressive. The other thing is that, currently, in order to get economic incentives for forestry practices, you need to own a large piece of timberland. And I'm sensitive to that. In the Finger Lakes area where I live, most of the forest land is, I own 18 acres of forest land, and I'm fairly typical of those who own land in the Finger Lakes. If you're outside of the state parks and the national forest, my forest land is very, very typical. No one owns 1,000 acres, which is what the cutoff is for getting state aid. And I've watched as recently as a year ago, 30 acres of forest next door to me got clear cut because there's no economic incentives for keeping that intact. The implementation plan calls for lowering the scale at which we pay attention to forest management. And I lost a little track as to where we ended up in the end, but I think we set it at 15 acres. It's certainly much, much lower than the hundreds of acres we're at now. So I think those are really good things, first personally.
Barbara?
Thank you. Peter, you were talking about money and budget, no clear recommendations coming out on how this might be paid for. a couple of points, a question and a comment. I'm assuming you're talking to people in the governor's office, maybe the governor directly or other, I don't know who their environmental and energy staff are at this point, or people in NYSERDA, wherever, about their thinking, or people in the legislature, chair of the energy committees and so on, speakers, central staff, ways and means. Is anyone seriously, I mean, I know there was a bill on a carbon tax, but what's the discussion between folks like you and people in the governor's office and legislature about what they're thinking about, what might be feasible, what path they might be going down? That's a question. And again, obviously, we're not even going to have this plan for another year, right? So budgets, you know, are they going to start budgeting for a plan that isn't even approved until hopefully the end of this year? So that's a question. But my other kind of comment and point is I have a little bit of I'm sure other people have ins into these industries. My son is an engineer and project manager for an engineering consulting firm in the DC area. And they've just gotten his firm, not him personally, but his firm has just gotten a big contract for one of the wind projects off Long Island and one of the New York projects. And he said, you know, there just aren't the workers out there to do these projects. They're not there. And even in the engineers, the higher level people that are going to be needed, whether it's actual engineering on wind, all the connection issues, the permitting issues, there's going to be a huge shortage of engineers. They're going to have to train engineers to move from one field of engineering into another. There's a whole lag in terms of training the workforce to even begin these projects, you know, so that's going to create a lag. So I'm wondering whether, you know, again, you say governor's supportive of all of this. Is there talk about, we know where we have to go here. Is there talk about money now in this, at least in this year's budget, for training of workers and at all levels? They're going to need all levels of workers doing these projects. Any talk about labor money for worker retraining and all that kind of thing, or just new money? I don't know, you know, all those pockets of worker training money, but what's the deal on how are we going to get our workforce ready to really, because we're going to be behind on day one, way behind on day one, from what my son's telling me.
Yeah. So first question just was about the state budget. I mean,
yeah,
the analysis is in the climate, the draft plan says that New York State needs to be spending at least $10 billion a year on clean energy. And that's not necessarily within the confines of the state budget, but out inside the budget, off budget, you know, how all the different agencies, we need to be spending that level of resources every year and increasing over time to achieve the benefits of the plan and to make the transition. That's a huge number. And there's a number of us that are advocating aggressively for a $15 billion pot of money in this current budget cycle to try to get the things moving. That will do things like job training and worker assistance programs that will help New Yorkers cut their energy bills by incentivizing electric vehicles and electric heating and cooling systems, either geothermal or heat pump systems. So there's a lot of things that needed to get supported and funding for, and that's a key piece of it. And we also need to provide resources to local governments. A lot of this stuff is going to get real at the local government levels, and quite frankly, they don't have the staffing and capacity, much like there aren't engineers to do wind. We need local governments to have the staffing and capacity resources. So we need, quite frankly, need just grants in the state budget going in to support comprehensive planning and implementation of this climate law at the local level. And I will just say this in terms of, just to round up the answer to your question before we jump to the next one, is New York State did go after in the last 2 weeks a federal grant to do a lot of what you were laying out there, Barbara, to look for resources to help with training, to create those good jobs, but also create the infrastructure educationally using community college, as well as other entities that are working in the energy efficiency space and elsewhere, to match up the needs and the identified jobs that are out there, and to create the the programs that are institutes of higher learning. So New York State is aggressively going after those funds to try to grab those federal dollars to put them into play here. But you're right. I mean, we are behind now, but there is a lot of will and pent up energy to go after resources to begin this whole process.
Thank you, Peter.
Other questions? I'm not looking at the chat, so somebody else has to.
Yeah, there are two in the chat. One from Miles and one from Mike Gerard. Do you want me to read them or?
Yeah, go ahead,
Okay,
please.
so the one from, I'll do Miles McManus first. Is the CLCPA likely to be challenged at the federal level once entrenched industry interests start to see regulation coming? If so, any guess how it would fare?
I never like to welcome lawsuits. I figure once we start, getting into the sector by sector regulations, business and industry will try to gum things up and challenge them probably at first in state court, Miles, versus federally. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't guess. Maybe Amy, who is a lawyer, can sort of wade into here as to what might be the federal course of challenge. But yeah, it's just, the entrenched interest of doing what they're doing. They have AstroTurf style campaigns up now. They're doing mailers to their heating customers upstate New York, trying to scare them about cost and drive fear here. So I'm assuming that they'll also do a litigative tool out of their toolbox at some point on sections of the CLCPA.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer either, but and at the council level, we've never discussed that. We just we're assuming that the CLCPA is the law, and we need to come up with a plan that'll make it work. But I as a non-lawyer, I think it's fairly robust. I am more worried about the educational aspects than the anti-educational aspects, the false campaigns that Peter talked about. And I regularly hear that I should be heating my house with propane instead of the ground source geothermal system I have because it's better for the environment, right? Well, that's crazy, but the industry is working hard to get that messaging out, and so I'm worried about a backlash from that because, in fact, the plan is good for the economy of the state. It's going to be good for consumers, but there's going to be so much false information out there. We need to be ahead of that false information campaign, and so far, I don't know that we are. So that's my biggest worry.
Yeah. Hey, Nick, I'll summarize Mike Gerard's comment here in the chat. It's essentially how we're going to get massive growth in solar over time. And unfortunately, the early entrance to the marketplace is what we've seen with regular development is greenfields being eyed for solar development. And it's because those greenfields are proximate to transmission lines. So we have to change transmission rules a little bit. At the Public Service Commission level, we need an aggressive sort of take on looking at brownfield opportunities for building out solar, and we have to concentrate more on the built environment that we already have, rather than doing so much build out of solar in areas where one, there's community concern, two, there's biodiversity impacts, and three, we could be turning over good farmland that we need for crops. Into solar installation. So we have to have a little bit of a smarter take on it and a faster look at developed areas for solar, rooftops, parking lots, brownfields, rights of ways on highways where already we've kind of built through a lot of different things to go on. I know that's an overly simplistic answer to your big question, but yeah, we're going to have to really build out a heck of a lot more solar and obviously hit our wind generating targets by 2030 as well.
So
Peter, if I could just ask, I mean, have you quantified that? Have you quantified what's the maximum amount that could be built on brownfields and rooftops and so forth? Do the numbers really add up to where you need to be?
I don't know if that's been quantified. It's certainly not in the draft, but I know that there's a sort of a subgroup at the Public Service Commission, the ISO, and the utilities that are trying to sort of really identify that. To be frank, Mike, I don't know if this is your question, but the acreage.
Yeah.
So
I don't think.
Seems to me that we're all sort of tiptoeing, maybe not tiptoeing is the right word, around a set of questions about how all of the things that need to happen can be aligned in the time frame in which we have them. We've had cost analyses and job analyses that show positive results for doing the right thing for decades. And right now, one of the questions that I have asked Peter a bunch of times, but is sort of buried in what I think Barbara was asking is, even if we get the will and the money, are we going to be able to build a green energy infrastructure that can supply this conversion across the entire economy, not just cars, not just houses, not just industry, all of them at the same time to have results by 2030, which is the first hard deadline in the law. And I guess one other question for you is, how do we build, is there a different coalition pushing for this change than there was 5 years ago? And how are we going to, as Bob was alluding, we've got false information. We've got the same people fighting us who've been fighting us for a long time. They pretend to be doing more of the right stuff. But what's different other than this law that says we have to do this now?
Well, I mean, at the larger level, climate change is more in our face than ever before, and the warnings from the IPCC are more in the face than ever before, and the press is finally doing a better job than they've done over most of the last decade or so. So, there are certainly climate deniers, but there are fewer and fewer of them, and more people do realize the existential threat. I mean, if you look at the IPCC summary, which came out this week, it says that this decade, by the end of this decade, within the next 8 years, is really the last meaningful window we have to seriously reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we should be trying globally to reduce them by 50% over that time period. So New York's goal of 40% isn't all that ambitious when you look at it that way. The report goes on and says to fail to do that will severely damage the ability of societies to exist into the future in the way that we're used to. And so, I think we need to get that messaging out, and we need to show that, yeah, we have some huge challenges here in New York to make it all happen. But the draft implementation plan does lay it out, and what we really need now is to mobilize the appropriate level of forces. It'd be great if the federal forces help, and I know the president's trying to do that, but I think we need to be prepared to do it on our own in case Washington remains as Washington is as well. And whether we can do it, I do think we can do it. There's a tremendous training challenges and job creation challenges, but I think if the citizenry of our state grasps both the urgency and the opportunity, and it's a huge opportunity to make our state a global leader in this area. That's good for the economy. It's good for our morale. If we can convey some of that, I'm cautiously optimistic we can do that. Maybe I'm naive, but that's my vision.
Good. Peter?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly to that because I know we've got some great questions and good discussion going on in the chat as well. But, NYSERDA testified at the hearing, the budget hearing, and they anticipate that with the funding that they've got allocated and the projects that are, quote, in the pipeline of renewables, that they're about 65% of the way to the 70% renewable energy goal at 2030. So that's where it starts, right? Decarbonizing the electrons so that we can then get into the rest of it. And I'll just sort of add, remember when we look at sort of like vehicles, you got to sort of also open up your mindset to say that they're just not going to be vehicles anymore. They will be energy storage devices. So people kind of sort of assume that the electric vehicle now there is just a draw on the system, but it's a way to actually store wind energy in winter nights in upstate New York that gets lost in the lines now. And my neighbors aren't benefiting anymore from the electrons that come off of my rooftop solar system. They were until we got an electric car. That energy is now going into the battery of my electric car. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to sort of look at the challenge, but also open up your mind to the great opportunities that are out there too.
And market forces on transportation are moving us there. None of the major car manufacturers in the world are going to be making internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. And so that's just going to happen. It's moving us there. To me, and the electric sector is moving in the right way, as Peter says. To me, the biggest challenge is the retrofitting of our housing stock and our building stock. And that is a huge challenge. But I actually think this winter's challenges might wake people up. If you're paying twice this year for heating of what you paid last year because the natural gas industry's decided they can charge that for you, maybe you'll suddenly go, now really is the time to go with heat pumps. And by the way, the state is making it easier than ever before. Now's the time. I'm hoping that we can build on that momentum.
Yeah, I hope so too. Nick, are there more questions in the chat?
Yeah, I can read one from Mike Pratt. Peter, you mentioned some disappointment in the EJ elements of the plan. Could you talk about that in more detail and perhaps mention how the further hearing process might advance some of these concerns?
Yeah, thanks. Great question, Mike. Yeah, and I think the disappointment really was, a time constraint. We were really pressed as a council, trying our best to integrate what the Climate Justice Working Group had, but also, come to, through several different drafts from the end of October to December to meet our goal. And we just honestly just didn't have time enough as a council to get together and synthesize the Climate Justice Working Group comments and come to a consensus on which directions, not across the board. So there's things like renewable natural gas and using that in a way that would be combusted in New York City. Well, now with New York City's law, we aren't going to see that as an opportunity for renewable natural gas. And we don't want to see that sort of showing up as a displacement for diesel downstate. So there are things like that where the Climate Justice Working Group was very adamant and we shouldn't be doing these things. And the climate plan, as Bob alluded to, we dialed some of that language back at the December meeting, but there's more of it that needs to be looked at. And I think as organizations and New York Renews, the coalition that we're part of, is now synthesizing the inputs of the Climate Justice Working Group. And you'll see a lot of, I think, public comments saying, hey, you need to finalize this stuff. You need to, understand the equity frame that this august body has presented to the council. And before it goes final, we want to see these quote unquote false solutions taken out of the climate plan. We want to see the inconsistencies. I mean, with so-called renewable biogas, being used elsewhere isn't going to work because we're going to decommission the natural gas infrastructure. So it just doesn't really work. To say that we're going to have this resource and use it here. I think Bob and I are in agreement. We'd rather see that gas used locally in a non-combustion platform like a fuel cell. So there's a lot of pieces like that that still need to be ferreted out before we have this plan go final. As Bob said, we did some real-time wordsmithing over the interface at our December meeting, literally redlining a document. You can imagine redlining a document in a private meeting, but redlining a document in a web-based environment with the public watching was kind of interesting for both of us in December, but it had to be done. We had to strike language of inconsistencies, but there's more of that needs to be attended to. Sorry for the long answer, Mike.
That's a great answer. And a lot of it does have to do with the renewable natural gas and biofuels and these other false solutions. And they're sort of, they're embedded in various aspects. The draft implementation plan is a big, complicated document, right? And the chapters were written by different staff for different agencies, clearly. And so there's some reconciliation that still has to happen. And I think we have a fairly strong majority on the council to push in the correct direction. Certainly getting public comment will make it easier for Peter and I, and what I believe is a true majority, to do that. But we need to do it. And, I think in that December 20th meeting, quite frankly, Peter and I were the people pushed hardest on those issues. And I think we probably got 52% of the way through there. And if we'd had another 20 hours, we might have been able to do more. But, at the end, you cave and say, well, we'll settle the rest of these later.
Nick, anybody else?
Yeah, Barbara, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, just another quick follow-up on the, I don't know which one of you, Peter or Bob, on the building section. I've been wondering about, it talks about heat pumps, talks about getting off gas and all of that, electrification, but there's no clear discussion about insulation, weatherization. Is that part of it, or is that just,
No, it's in there, but it's a small part. But in truth, getting the heat pumps in is much more critical than getting the insulation. And for new homes, we should tighten up the standards and make sure they are super insulated. And that's easy and cheap to do in new construction, as well as putting in heat pumps, et cetera. For retrofits, dollar for dollar, we're better off putting our money into the heat pumps and catching up with insulation. People used to argue that, well, you have to start and super insulate a home before you even put in a heat pump. And that is not true, both economically and in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. The dollars are better spent in getting the heat pumps in first. So we deliberately emphasize that, not saying that we shouldn't be insulating, we shouldn't continue to move that, but trying to highlight the importance of getting those heat pumps. And quite frankly, even if putting the heat pumps in and retrofitting it leads what we're doing with the electric sector. The example, if you take a an old home that's currently heated with natural gas and you don't increase the envelope and you put in a ground source heat pump, even if that electricity is powered by natural gas, the emissions go way down while you're also moving towards the green electricity. So we tried to emphasize that aspect of it to get it moving so that we don't wait until all our homes are insulated and we wait till everything's green electricity in 2040 and then start the challenge of heat pumps. We need to start now. 6 million homes, literally, we need to get heat pumps into over the next 20, 25 years. And we want to do, half of those in the next 10 years. That's a lot of homes.
It is, but it sounds doable now that you say it that way.
I think it's doable, but it's, you're going to have to train a tremendous number of electricians and plumbers and get the contractors down to know what they're doing. And the building inspectors at the town and municipal level have to be there. And, we
And
need
the
to get that.
codes rewritten.
Yeah, and it calls for rewriting the codes soon. Yeah.
Yep.
Which is also on the table right now, budget-wise, is building energy codes, energy efficiency applied, standards. I mean, all that stuff is ready for action. It might not happen in the budget, but before this legislative session ends right now, those are some things that I know the EA is going to be working with others to bring across the finish line.
Let me just throw out one detail because I personally am fascinated by it, and I'd like to see other people weigh in on as we move forward over the next 10 months towards the final plan. The plan calls for heat pumps, beneficial electrification, but it's fairly silent as to the technology. And you look at the details, and the plan assumes that most people put in air source heat pumps because they're cheaper and easier to put in initially, but they're nowhere near as efficient. And so they cost more over time and they use more electricity over time. And particularly for upstate New York in the cold depths of winter, they are nowhere near as efficient as a ground source heat pump, which means that we have a real challenge of providing enough green electricity for like a 2 to 3 week period out of the year. We either need to store it or we need to have massive overcapacity for wind. Solar won't work because of the depth of winter. And it's my belief that if we push people towards ground source heat pumps, even though the initial cost is more expensive per home, that the overall system cost might be less because we don't need as much energy storage, we don't need as much overcapacitization. And I also think it's easier to change whole neighborhoods at a time. You can put in district level heat exchange systems. People who now delivering gas can pull the gas pipes out, street at a time, put in water distribution systems, and then we have a ground source heat pump in each individual home, and we can do that street by street, as opposed to letting individual homeowners decide the timing of when they transition. Because when you're talking 6 million homes, individual decisions, and you're trying to degasify at the same time, that's a huge challenge. So I've been pushing for that, and I think I got a little bit of the way, but not enough of the way there. And I'd love to see more people weigh in on those ideas over the next months.
Bob, I don't know what a ground source heat pump is.
Oh, okay. So sorry. Air source heat pump is
I know what
extracting environmental
right.
Energy from the atmosphere around you.
Yep.
And you put in 1 unit of electric energy and you get out about, if it's warm enough outside, and that would mean above about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, you get 2.7 units of heat energy out. Ground source heat pump is extracting that heat from groundwater or from the ground instead. Since the groundwater temperature doesn't change seasonally, it has no seasonality as for the air source heat pump. And you put in 1 unit of energy and you get out 4.5 or 5 instead of 2.7. So you're getting twice as much heat energy out. It's just the initial cost is more.
Thank you. I assume others might have benefited from that.
Yeah,
as well.
sorry, I'm too close to this stuff.
Geothermal.
Yeah, is it the same thing as geothermal?
Yeah, yes, it is.
That's what I was
But
asked, sorry.
Geothermal can also mean going really deep to where the earth is really warm and extracting superheat things. So we tend to prefer the ground source heat pump language because you're extracting heat from top 10 feet or top maybe 300 feet, not going down miles, which you would for geothermal.
So we are running out of time. So I think I'm going to ask our two extraordinary speakers to give some final thoughts if you have any. I'm sure you have lots, but keep them
I think
short.
I just gave mine, so I'll let Peter go on another question. Thank you.
I'm going to give mine by just encouraging people to get inspired about this plan, to understand that New York State is trying to actually lead and do it fast. But it's only going to get better if the voices of New Yorkers are coming out to the public hearing process. It's really important for Bob and I to be able to go back into our council meetings later this year and into the fall saying, this is where everybody is. This is where the people are. This is where we need to go and how fast we need to go. So I really think it's a huge opportunity to do that. I want to lift up one point from a way back when of one of my final comments that Jackie Bowen raised, which I think was a really important one. Quite frankly, I think, honestly, we just need to pay landowners the value of ecosystem services that they're providing. We shouldn't try to figure out some gaming system where we give them credit for offsets that they can then monetize. Let's just, quite frankly, protect more open space. And I think New York voters are going to have a huge opportunity with an Environmental Bond Act on the ballot this fall to be able to say yes again, the way they said a loud yes last fall for adding environmental rights to the Constitution. And I know this is probably music to John Ernst's ears and Willie's ears and yours, Jackie, but let's just pay farmers for the ecosystem services of carbon sequestration and then come right out and say that stuff. And the same thing with timber owners. And just my last point on that, we should be embedding carbon in products, not burning it. The Climate Action Plan is very detailed in a lot of different things, but the interesting thing that's about there is it's an honest discussion of the public health benefit or detriments of burning stuff, including wood. We got to get away from burning stuff, any kind of stuff. We just got to get away from doing it. And the faster we do it, the fewer people who get sick. And we know who gets sick in New York. But we also know that upstate New Yorkers are getting sick because we burn too much wood. But the faster we get away from combustion and move towards electrification and beneficial electrification, the greater the economic benefits, fewer people who are going to get sick. That means less co-pays if you're insured. That means less money on pharmaceuticals. And gosh, it just is plain common sense to move on to systems that are more energy efficient to cut our energy waste. It's foolish of us not to really, seize this moment in time in New Yorkers. And as you said at the outset, Amy, the world is watching us. The nation's watching us. We got to get this right. We can't rely on the Supreme Court with Brett Kavanaugh, who already voted to undercut the the Clean Power Plan. And the faster we move away from unstable and unpredictable fossil fuel prices, the better off we'll be as a state. The moment is ours for New Yorkers to seize.
Let me just add that in this incredibly depressing and troubled times, I think we really should be optimistic that New York can do this and that our doing it will make a difference. And I hope all of the citizens of the state realize that and join.
Well, I just want to thank the two of you for your leadership. You have made such a difference in this report, and we're counting on you to keep doing that. And we will apply pressure. We will give you cover. We will scream and yell. Things are different. I know I was being sort of challenging and difficult. We are in a very different place than we were 5 years ago. And New York is poised to really show the world how to do this and do it right. So here's to a hard year and a great outcome.
Right. So I'll just wrap up by saying thank you, Amy, for your wonderful questions tonight and your leadership on this panel and at the board level. And then just we will be following up with all of you with a link to this recording if you feel like others in your lives can benefit from hearing and seeing what we talked about tonight. We'll be doing that, and also obviously following up with more ways for people to get involved. But thanks, Amy. Thanks, Bob. It's great to be with you all. And thanks everybody for joining us. Great questions.
Thank you all. Take care.